The shriek of alarms ripped Jax from a troubled sleep, the floor vibrating beneath his bunk. He scrambled out, pulling on his boots, the red glare of emergency lights painting the prefab walls of his quarters a hellish crimson. New Eden, humanity's fragile foothold on Xantus, was under attack. Not by the Xantai this time, but by the planet itself. Mount Cinder, looming over the outpost, was erupting. Jax bolted for the command center, shoving past panicked colonists. Years spent rebuilding after Earth's near destruction had honed his instincts. Panic was a luxury they couldn't afford. "Status report," he yelled, his voice tight with urgency. "Lava flow heading directly for Sector 4, sir," a young technician shouted, her fingers dancing across a holographic display showing a creeping river of molten rock. "Terraforming equipment is at risk." Sector 4. Jax's heart hammered against his ribs. Years of work, his dream of cultivating Earth plants on this hostile world, all of it about to be incinerated. He grabbed a comm unit. "Evacuate Sector 4 immediately. Prioritize the hydroponics modules, we salvage what we can." Outside, the sky rained ash and fire. Jax directed the evacuation, the heat blistering his skin, the acrid air stinging his lungs. He saw a flash of crimson light near the lava flow, not the molten rock, but something else, shimmering and distinct. An Xantai. As the last transport rumbled away from the encroaching lava, the Xantai figure approached, her crystalline skin reflecting the fiery landscape like a fractured mirror. Her bioluminescent markings pulsed with an internal light, illuminating a face that held a mixture of curiosity and disdain. "Human," she said, her voice like the grinding of tectonic plates. "Explain this disruption." It was Kira, a Xantai geophysicist he'd encountered briefly at a research conference. Her presence here, amidst the chaos, surprised him. He knew the Xantai considered these lands sacred, but her tone suggested something more than mere concern for the environment. "This is a natural phenomenon," Jax explained, wiping sweat and ash from his brow. "We're just trying to survive it, same as you." Kira's prehensile tail lashed behind her, stirring the ash-laden air. "Survival is earned, not taken. Your terraforming efforts destabilize this planet. You endanger us all." Her words were a slap in the face. He'd lost everything once. The thought of jeopardizing humanity's future, of being responsible for another catastrophe, sent a chill down his spine. He wanted to argue, to defend his work, his dream, but the tremor beneath their feet, the roar of the volcano, drowned out his words. He was suddenly acutely aware of how vulnerable they both were, standing on the precipice of destruction. Another tremor, stronger this time, sent a shower of rocks cascading down the mountainside. One, larger than the rest, hurtled towards Kira. Jax reacted instinctively, lunging forward, his hand brushing against her crystalline skin, a strange, electric sensation coursing through him. He pulled her out of the rock's path, the force of the impact throwing them both to the ground. For a moment, they lay there, amidst the ash and the embers, his hand still resting on her arm. Her skin was surprisingly warm, the crystalline surface radiating heat. He looked up into her luminous eyes, and for the first time, he saw not suspicion or disdain, but something akin to surprise. Perhaps even gratitude. The alarm klaxon wailed in the distance, a stark reminder of the danger still surrounding them, but in that moment, amidst the ashes of his hopes, a strange, unexpected ember of something else began to flicker. The acrid smell of sulfur hung heavy in the air, clinging to Jax like a second skin. New Eden was a mess, scorched earth, twisted metal, and the ever-present dusting of grey ash. The lava flow had stopped mercifully short of the main hydroponics bay, but the damage was extensive. His dream, those fragile green shoots pushing through Xantian soil, felt more fragile than ever. He needed answers, and he knew the Xantai had them. The Xantai Geothermal Research Facility was a stark contrast to the ramshackle human outpost. Smooth, obsidian walls curved and flowed, powered by the planet's internal heat. Jax felt out of place, his worn canvas jacket and dusty boots a jarring contrast to the Xantai's sleek, bioluminescent attire. He'd requested a meeting with the head geophysicist, hoping for collaboration, but the Xantai Council had been less than receptive. Human interference was the prevailing theory for the increased volcanic activity, and cooperation was the last thing on their minds. He found Kira in a vast chamber, surrounded by holographic displays depicting Xanthus's complex geothermal network. Her crimson skin seemed to glow in the dim light, her prehensile tail swaying rhythmically as she studied the data. Seeing her again, the memory of her warmth beneath his hand sent a surprising jolt through him. "You," she said, her voice flat, devoid of the hostility from their previous encounter. "I need to understand what's happening to this planet," Jax said, keeping his tone neutral, professional. He couldn't afford to let his personal feelings, however unexpected, cloud his judgment. "We understand," Kira replied, her tail flicking dismissively. "Human terraforming disrupts the delicate balance of our world. Our methods are carefully calibrated," Jax countered. "We're not trying to cause harm." Kira turned, her luminous eyes fixing on him. "Intent is irrelevant. The consequences are real." She gestured to the holographic displays. "See for yourself. The geothermal activity has increased exponentially since your arrival. Our models predict further instability." Jax studied the displays, his mind racing. The Xantai's data was undeniable. Could their terraforming efforts truly be responsible for this? The thought weighed heavily on him. He had come to Xanthus seeking rebirth, not destruction. "What if," Jax began, hesitantly, "what if we combined our data? Our understanding of plant life, your knowledge of geothermal systems. Maybe together we could find a solution." A flicker of something he couldn't quite decipher, curiosity, maybe even a hint of respect, crossed Kira's face. "The Council would never agree," she said, her voice softening slightly. "They see humans as a threat." "But you don't," Jax said, meeting her gaze. He saw a vulnerability in her eyes, a conflict mirroring his own. He knew he should be focusing on the immediate crisis, on saving his people and their fragile colony, but he couldn't shake the feeling that something more significant was at stake, something that connected him to this alien woman in a way he couldn't explain. A low rumble echoed through the facility, shaking the floor. The holographic displays flickered, showing a surge of geothermal energy deep beneath the surface. Kira's markings pulsed rapidly. "Another eruption," she whispered, her voice laced with fear. This one felt different, more powerful. "My city, it's in the path." Before Jax could react, Kira was gone, a streak of crimson light disappearing down a corridor. He hesitated for only a moment, his duty to his people warring with a sudden, overwhelming urge to protect her. He pushed the thought aside and followed. He found her in a control room, frantically trying to reroute geothermal energy away from her city. "It's no use," she said, despair creeping into her voice. "The system is overloaded. We're too late." Jax's mind raced, remembering the makeshift geothermal regulators they'd used to divert lava flows back on Earth. It was a long shot, but it might be their only chance. "I have an idea," he said, grabbing a comm unit. "But I need your help." The tremors grew more frequent, each one a hammer blow against Jax's fraying nerves. Xanthus was a ticking time bomb, and Kira's city, nestled in a valley carved by ancient lava flows, was directly in the blast radius. Following Kira's crimson form through the Xantai city's crystalline tunnels, he felt a strange protectiveness welling up inside him, a primal urge to shield her from the impending disaster. He relayed his improvised plan to his team back at New Eden, his voice tight with urgency. They were skeptical, but Jax's reputation for ingenuity preceded him. He needed specific components, salvaged from the damaged terraforming equipment, and he needed them fast. As the Xantai around them began to panic, their bioluminescent markings flashing erratically, Kira translated his instructions, her voice surprisingly calm. Her trust in him, in this chaotic moment, both humbled and terrified him. His team arrived with the equipment, faces grim, covered in ash. Jax directed them, his mind racing, adapting Earthborn technology to Xantai systems. It was a desperate gamble, a fusion of human ingenuity and Xantai knowledge, a testament to the potential for collaboration that had yet to truly blossom between their species. He felt Kira's gaze on him, a silent question in her luminous eyes. He offered a reassuring smile, though his heart hammered against his ribs. The ground shook violently, throwing them off their feet. The air crackled with energy. The eruption had begun. Jax scrambled to his feet, checking the connections, his hands shaking. He glanced at Kira, her face pale, the bioluminescence of her markings dimmed. He reached out, his hand hovering over her arm, hesitant. He wasn't sure if his touch would comfort or offend, if his human skin would cause her crystalline form harm. He took a chance, gently placing his hand on her arm. Her skin was warm, almost vibrating with the planet's energy. He felt a strange connection, a shared vulnerability in the face of impending disaster. "It will work," he said, his voice firm, trying to convince himself as much as her. The makeshift regulator began to hum, diverting the geothermal flow, channeling the planet's fury away from the city. The tremors intensified, the crystalline tunnels groaning under the strain. Jack saw a fissure open in the wall, widening rapidly. He pulled Kira towards him, shielding her body with his own as the tunnel collapsed behind them, cutting off their escape route. They were trapped, the roar of the eruption echoing around them, the air thick with dust and the smell of sulfur. Jax pulled Kira closer, holding her tight. In that moment, surrounded by chaos and fear, he felt a strange sense of peace. He was with her, and for the first time since losing his family on Earth, he didn't feel alone. Kira pulled back slightly, her luminous eyes searching his. "Why?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the din. "Why risk your life for me, for my people?" He looked at her, the crimson glow of her skin reflecting in his eyes. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said simply. He didn't tell her about the emptiness he'd carried for so long, the gaping hole left by the loss of his family. He didn't tell her that helping her, protecting her, felt like a way to honor their memory, to finally start rebuilding his own life amidst the ashes of the old. He simply held her close, his hand tracing the delicate contours of her crystalline cheek. A tremor, stronger than any before, shook the cavern. A large section of the ceiling began to crumble. Jax knew they had to get out, but the only exit was blocked. He saw a narrow crevice, barely wide enough for a human, leading upwards. He looked at Kira, her eyes filled with fear. "Go," he said, pushing her towards the crevice. "I'll find another way." Kira hesitated, her tail lashing nervously. "No," she said, her voice firm. "We go together, or not at all." He saw the determination in her eyes, the same fierce spirit that had initially made him wary of her, now filled him with a strange sense of hope. He knew arguing was pointless. He squeezed her hand, a silent promise, and together, they climbed towards the surface, towards an uncertain future. The flickering light of Kira's datapad cast eerie shadows on the rough-hewn walls of the collapsed tunnel. Dust motes danced in the beam, a ghostly ballet against the backdrop of their precarious sanctuary. She looked at Jax, the crimson of her skin muted in the dim light, her bioluminescent markings pulsing slowly, like a dying ember. "This is my research," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "The human terraforming, it's disrupting the harmonic resonance of Xanthus's geothermal core. The vibrations, they're escalating the instability." Jax took the datapad, his heart sinking as he scrolled through the data. The Xanthi models were complex, but the conclusion was clear. His dream, the very thing he'd dedicated his life to, was tearing this planet apart. The weight of that realization pressed down on him, heavier than the collapsed tunnel threatening to become their tomb. "The Council won't listen," Kira continued, her voice laced with despair. "They refuse to believe humans can be anything but a destructive force." He looked at her, seeing the vulnerability in her luminous eyes. He thought of his own people, struggling to survive on this hostile world, and the Xanthi, clinging to their traditions in the face of impending disaster. He was caught between two worlds, torn between his duty and a burgeoning feeling for this alien woman that he couldn't ignore. "Then we'll make them listen," he said, his voice firm despite the tremor of fear that ran through him. "We'll find a solution, together." A flicker of hope ignited in Kira's eyes, fragile but bright. "There may be a way," she said, her tail twitching with a nervous energy. "A stabilization technique, but it requires access to the planetary core. It's dangerous. Forbidden." Jax met her gaze, the flicker of hope in her eyes mirroring his own. "Then we'll go," he said, his hand finding hers, his human skin tingling at the contact with her crystalline surface. For a moment, he hesitated, fearing he might hurt her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his, a silent pact formed in the heart of their shared peril. The journey to the planetary core was a treacherous descent into the heart of Xantus. The tunnels were unstable, the air thick with the stench of sulfur and the low rumble of the planet's unrest. Kira, using her unique ability to sense geothermal fluctuations, guided them through the labyrinthine network, her hand never leaving his. He felt a profound connection to her, a shared vulnerability that transcended their cultural differences, their biological disparities. He was no longer just a human, and she was no longer just an Xantai. They were two souls, bound together by a shared purpose, a shared fear, and a shared hope. When they reached the core chamber, a vast cavern pulsating with geothermal energy, they found it guarded by a contingent of Xantai warriors. Kira stepped forward, her markings blazing with an inner fire. She spoke in rapid Xantai, her voice ringing with authority. Jax didn't understand the words, but he understood the defiance in her tone, the conviction in her stance. She was risking everything, her position, her safety, to stand by him, to stand by humanity. The warriors hesitated, their bioluminescent markings flickering with uncertainty. Then, the ground shook violently, the cavern walls groaning under the strain. A new fissure opened, spewing molten rock into the chamber. The warriors turned, their attention drawn to the immediate danger. Kira grabbed Jax's hand, pulling him towards the core control panel. This was it. Their one chance. "We have to reroute the energy flow," she said, her voice urgent. "But it will take both of us." They worked together, Jax's human ingenuity complementing Kira's deep understanding of Xantus's geothermal systems. They were a symphony of contrasting movements, his rough hands manipulating the alien technology, her crystalline fingers dancing across the control panels. He felt her warmth against his skin, the electric tingle of their touch, and for the first time, he understood the true meaning of connection, of unity. It wasn't just about saving two worlds. It was about saving each other. The core chamber pulsed with a raw, untamed energy. Jax felt it thrumming through the soles of his boots, resonating in his bones. He and Kira stood before the control panel, a symphony of contrasting elements, his rough, calloused hands hovering over the alien technology, her crystalline fingers dancing across the glowing glyphs. He glanced at her, the crimson of her skin reflecting the core's fiery light, her markings pulsing rhythmically. A strange mix of fear and exhilaration coursed through him. This was it. Their one chance to save both their worlds. "Ready?" Kira asked, her luminous eyes meeting his. He saw a flicker of doubt in their depths, a fear mirroring his own. He nodded, his throat suddenly tight. He placed his hand on the control panel, his skin tingling at the contact with the alien metal. He felt Kira's hand brush against his, her touch sending a jolt through his arm, a strange, electric sensation that was both comforting and alarming. He hesitated, afraid his touch might harm her, but she didn't flinch. Instead, her fingers intertwined with his, a silent promise passed between them in the heart of Xantus. Together, they manipulated the controls, rerouting the geothermal flow, channeling the planet's fury away from the populated areas. The chamber trembled, the air thick with the smell of sulfur and ozone. The energy surged, threatening to overload the system. Jax felt a wave of dizziness, the raw power of the core washing over him. He stumbled, his vision blurring. Kira's hand tightened around his, anchoring him, her touch a lifeline in the chaos. "Jax," she cried, her voice sharp with concern. "The conduit, it's overloading." He blinked, his vision clearing. He saw it then, a pulsating vein of energy threatening to rupture. He knew what he had to do. He had to close the conduit manually, but it meant exposing himself to the full force of the core's energy. It was a suicide mission. He looked at Kira, her face etched with fear. He saw a flicker of understanding in her eyes, a realization of what he was about to do. He opened his mouth to say something, to reassure her, to tell her, what? That he loved her? That he had found something on this alien world he thought he'd lost forever? The words caught in his throat. Before he could speak, she pulled him close, her crystalline cheek pressing against his. The contact was surprisingly warm, the crystalline surface radiating heat. He felt her lips brush against his, a fleeting touch that sent a wave of warmth through him, melting the fear, the doubt, the loneliness that had been his constant companions for so long. Then, she pushed him away, her eyes filled with a fierce determination. "No," she said, her voice firm. "I'll do it." Before he could protest, she was gone, a streak of crimson light disappearing into the heart of the energy surge. He watched in horror as she wrestled with the conduit, her body bathed in the blinding light, her markings blazing with an almost unbearable intensity. He wanted to scream, to run after her, but he knew it was too late. He could only watch, helpless, as she battled the planet's fury, her love for him, her belief in humanity, driving her forward. Then, the light faded. The chamber fell silent. The energy stabilized. Kira lay on the ground, her body still, her markings dimmed. He rushed to her side, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt beside her, his hand trembling as he reached out to touch her. "Kira," he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. Her eyes fluttered open, a weak smile gracing her lips. "It's done," she whispered, her voice barely audible. He pulled her close, holding her tight, his tears mingling with the dust on her crystalline skin. He didn't care if his touch might harm her. He didn't care about the consequences, the dangers that still lay ahead. He only cared about her. He had found something on this alien world he never expected, something more precious than any dream of rebirth, something worth fighting for. He had found love amidst the ashes. And he knew, with a certainty that resonated deep within his soul, that together, they would face whatever the future held. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would forge a new beginning, not just for humanity, and not just for the Xantai, but for themselves.